This is The Big Breakdown, a long look back at some of the biggest stories we're covering for you at the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. This is Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Here now, Tony Brueski.
How many red flags does it take before an institution decides that someone isn't just difficult, but dangerous? That's a question no one really wants to ask out loud, especially not when the stakes involve a department, a university, and one of the most haunting mass murder cases in recent memory. Families don't go looking for lawsuits because they want drama. They do it because the people who were supposed to see something didn't, or at least they didn't act like what they saw mattered, or legally their hands are completely tied. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. That is a reality for many institutions. As much as we want emotion to play into this, people do have rights. And in some cases, universities or any institution or any business is basically set up to be sued no matter what you do. Get rid of someone because they're creepy and odd but haven't broken a law, you're going to get sued by the person. Keep somebody that is creepy and odd, and you risk them doing something horrible or getting into territory that then gets you sued by the people that are made to feel the way they are. It's a big gray area that no one wants to talk about because no one really has an answer on how to do anything with it other than react after something has taken place. That's a territory that we're stepping into today. The Goncalves family, Kaylee's family, is preparing to sue Washington State University. And make no mistake, they're not saying WSU caused the murders. They're not claiming the university could have predicted the violence that was coming. What they're arguing is something far more uncomfortable and far more complicated and far more relevant to anyone who's ever trusted an institution to protect the vulnerable. They're arguing that WSU saw warning signs, real ones, documented ones, repeated ones, signs that the man in their PhD program wasn't just awkward or abrasive or struggling, signs that he was making women uncomfortable, creeping out his classmates, and showing behavioral patterns that went well beyond the normal headaches of graduate school dynamics, signs that didn't just blink red, that they screamed. But did anything cross over into territory where they could have acted sooner than they did? Do we give too long of a rope, too many warnings, too many opportunities for those that we know are vile to fix their vile ways? When we know in reality they never will. We just have to count down and hope they don't cause enough problems or hurt too many people before an institution gets there. So let's go there. Let's talk about this. Let's walk through what people at WSU were actually saying about Bryan Kohberger before the murders. Let's go through what they wrote down, what they talked about in meetings, what they emailed each other, and what female students whispered to one another in hallways when they thought no one else was listening. Because once you see the full picture, the word red flag, it almost feels too soft. But it's the word that's used. What we're talking about is a pattern of behavior so consistent, so specific, and so alarming that it stands out even in hindsight as something really no one should have shrugged at. But I feel like we've been too conditioned to do this for far too long. To understand the gravity of all this, we have to look first at the environment that he walked into. The criminology program at Washington State University is small, tight, a place where everybody knows everybody. Faculty, they rely heavily on their graduate students to teach, assist, and guide undergrads. These aren't giant lecture halls with thousands of anonymous faces. This is a setting where a TA actually has power, a teaching assistant, influence, proximity, relationships. And that proximity means the power imbalance can be felt in every office hour, every classroom discussion, every late night research meeting. Students trust that these people in these roles are stable, respectful, and safe to be around. And universities trust that the graduate students they hire aren't going to cause harm intentionally or otherwise. That's the baseline. But from the moment Kohberger stepped into the WSU program, something was off. It wasn't subtle. Multiple people picked up on it immediately. He came in older than the average student, intense, academically serious, but socially abrasive in a way that wasn't just quirky, it was unsettling. People described him as someone who seemed to enjoy conflict, especially when it came to women challenging him, someone who leaned into confrontation instead of shying away from it, someone who didn't just break social norms, but shattered them, seemingly in a way that he didn't even understand. And that's scary when you get that type of character in a place, when they don't even see how uncomfortable they are making other people. That lack of self-awareness can be very spooky and can go to great lengths to harm others without any sort of regard or hesitation. And that brings us to the first major category of red flags. The women in the department didn't feel comfortable around him at all. Not early on, not later, not ever. Over and over again, reports and interviews detail the same behavior. He stared, not quick glances, but curious, over-the-top stares. Prolonged, lingering stares that made women feel watched, studied, observed in a way that set off internal alarms. He stood too close, he hovered, he blocked people's paths in hallways, he lingered outside offices, he showed up in places where women didn't expect him to be, and this wasn't one woman saying it. It was several. The kind of thing that when you hear it from one person, you might chalk it up to a personality mismatch. But when you hear it from many, and this is what makes this situation a bit different and gives it legs, if you will. It's a pattern of behavior. And unfortunately, a lot of institutions, a lot of ways of dealing with these problems don't necessarily watch for patterns of behavior. They look at individual incidents and handle them individually, rather than putting the dot here, putting the dot there, putting another dot here, and hey, look, we got a pattern going on. When people start avoiding being alone with him, when women at the university, smart, educated, socially aware women, are quietly forming strategies to avoid a man in their own department, you have a problem. That is not awkwardness. That is fear. There were also incidents where he physically boxed people in, standing in doorways or inches too close, creating what faculty called a spatial trapping. That's a behavioral red flag recognized in both criminology and psychology, using space, body positioning, and physical presence to control or intimidate another person. One faculty member even described moments when female students seemed desperate to escape an interaction with him, only relaxing once someone else stepped in. These are not normal classroom dynamics. They're the seeds of something darker, something universities are supposed to be trained to recognize. But are they? Are we? And recognizing it is just one thing, but what do you do about it? What if that checklist, that box of things you need to go through for any sort of truly meaningful, actionable resolution to take place is just too long? Meaning, yeah, you can start checking the boxes, but by the time something actually finally gets done, the damage is already there. That's, I think, the gray area that everyone needs to be looking at in every aspect of their world, their life, their business, their workplace, their school, whatever it may be. Recognizing the behavior in others that isn't safe, that isn't right earlier, and calling it out for what it is. Not just, oh, they're awkward, they're this, they're that. But for being potentially dangerous. And then we get into that problem, that word potentially. Potentially and legally are two different things. Now, we don't necessarily have a system that is set up to protect the vulnerable, the innocent, from the predatory in a way that accurately and safely and justly defends the rights of both. Because not everybody who's weird and awkward is predatory. There are a lot of people out there that don't get it, for lack of a better term. As scientific as it is, they don't get it. But we all know them. There are folks that just, they don't have those sort of senses about them. They're harmless, but they're not predatory. And then you have some that are just flat out predatory, and that's the only mode that they know. Both can present rather similarly at first. But what is that line that one draws when they know this is more than just someone that's awkward, someone that may be autistic, that doesn't have great social skills, to this person potentially is a threat to everyone around them? That's what we're wrestling with. And in the comments section on YouTube, give me your thoughts. Give me, because I'm not here to make excuses for WSU. I'm here just talking about the environment to which we live, and to where the hands can be tied over here and they're tied over here. And what do you do? What can we do? Because something needs to be done. So you have the pattern of Kohberger boxing people in, making them uncomfortable. And if that's not unsettling enough, wait until you hear how people talked about him behind closed doors. This is where the red flags stop being hints and start becoming neon. People in the department, graduate students, professors, began using a specific set of words to describe him. Not awkward, not quirky, but creepy, sexist, condescending, hostile towards women. And the one that should send chills down everyone's spine, possible future rapist. That wasn't a joke. That wasn't hyperbole. That was a sentiment expressed by people who interacted with him daily. Imagine being part of a department where your colleagues, your peers, your classmates are openly speculating whether another student in the building is dangerous, and not in a vague way, in a very specific, very gendered way. A professor even told investigators later that she works with predators and believed Kohberger fit the profile. She wasn't saying he committed a crime. She was saying the behavior patterns, the controlling body language, the hostility towards women, the desire to dominate classroom discussions, the belittling comments aligned with traits she recognized professionally. That's what the allegations are, essentially. It's a red flag so bright it should have lit the entire building. But we're not done. We are not done. Because the next layer involves actual conduct as a TA. Behavior that doesn't just upset students, but force the university to take formal disciplinary action. Students accused him of grading women more harshly than men, of speaking to female students with rudeness and condescension. Condescension, not condensation. Condensation would mean he was speaking and there was condensation coming out of his mouth and landing on people. Although that might, who knows? He seems like a close talker. Condescension. Or treating them like they were beneath him. Multiple complaints came in about the same theme. His attitude towards women was not just dismissive, it was contemptuous. And this wasn't just whispered in hallways. Students filed formal complaints, emails were sent, and in some cases, those emails included 911 in the subject line to signal urgency, allegedly. Think about that. A university student felt so uncomfortable, allegedly, with the TA's behavior that she used 911 in the subject line of a formal communication. That's not someone overreacting. That's someone who's afraid. It means right now something needs to be done. This can't be some sort of bureaucratic paper trail that we end up dealing with 3 years down the line, which is exactly what we're doing right now. Inside the grad student office, they had a tally board allegedly tracking his lateness, his outbursts, his inappropriate comments. When coworkers have to start keeping score inside their workplaces to manage someone's behavior, something is deeply wrong, and WSU wasn't oblivious. The lawsuit alleges they knew. They documented it. They met with him. They warned him. They constructed a timeline that in any other institution would have triggered something far more serious in a few meetings and a disciplinary plan. That's the allegation. Because they did go through this process. They did have a plan. And he failed. And he was let go. And then he killed 4 people. But let's walk through this timeline. The first altercation with the professor happened on about September 23rd of 2022, allegedly, not long after he entered the program. This wasn't a disagreement. It was an incident serious enough that it required an official conversation about his conduct. On October 3rd, the university sat him down to discuss his professionalism. That's early in a program to already need that kind of conversation. A TA expected to represent the department shouldn't be having that kind of meeting within a month of starting. On October 21st, he received an email saying he still wasn't meeting expectations. That's a written notice. It's a paper trail. When universities document behavior, it's not accidental. Someone is preparing for escalation if needed. And in November, the department held mandatory behavioral training for graduate students, training that multiple insiders later said was prompted by him. Think about that. An entire group of graduate students dragged into a meeting because one person's behavior was so disruptive, the department felt the need to intervene collectively. On December 9th, he had a second altercation, allegedly, with the same professor. 2 confrontations, 2 different months, escalating tone. And 10 days later, on December 19th, just over a month after the murders, WSU fired him from his TA position for behavioral issues. This wasn't a student who was flying under the radar. This wasn't someone who kept his head down and blended in. This was someone whose pattern of behavior was so consistent, so problematic, and so gender-focused that it created an escalating series of meetings, warnings, interventions, and eventually termination. Universities do not fire graduate students from TA positions casually. That's the academic equivalent of a workplace saying, "We can't trust you with people." But here's the question the Goncalves family is implicitly raising. If the university saw enough to fire him in December, what do they think his behavior meant in September, or October, or November? What did they think the women's complaints signaled? And why didn't those red flags trigger a more serious internal response? Now, to be fair, and this matters, some behaviors that people noticed only became meaningful after the murders. The disheveled appearance, the sudden shift in demeanor, the refusal to engage in any classroom conversation about the murdered students. A student reported seeing him with what looked like bloody knuckles right after the killings. Another noted that he stopped bringing his phone to class after the murder. Someone else recalled him making a comment that the killer may have been pretty good and that it might be a one-and-done type situation. If you heard those things from random classmates, maybe you'd shrug them off. After the murders, though, they became eerie. But again, we can't retroactively blame WSU for things they didn't know during the actual fall semester at hand. The real issue here isn't hindsight. It's the behavior the university did know about, the behavior they documented while it was happening wasn't benign. It wasn't harmless. It wasn't grad school stress. It was gendered, targeted, and repeated. And that matters. Because When women start sending 911 emails about the TA's behavior, that's a sign of potential danger. When faculty discuss a student as a possible predator, that's a sign. When a department feels compelled to hold mandatory training because one student is creating problems, that's a sign. When someone is fired because their behavior escalates to the point of serious professional failure, that's a sign too. The Goncalves family argument is not that WSU should have predicted murder. It's that WSU recognized the behavior as a pattern with sexual and predatory overtones, and that once you're in that territory, universities carry a higher responsibility. When you see a pattern of hostility towards women, boundary violations, physical intimidation, and growing volatility, institutions are supposed to understand that this isn't an academic issue. It's a safety one. Now, WSU will have its own argument, and it will be a strong one. Universities aren't law enforcement. They don't evaluate students using criminal risk metrics. They don't investigate unproven allegations without evidence. They don't remove students based on personality clashes or social awkwardness. WSU did meet with him. They did warn him. They did implement a behavioral pattern, and they did fire him. From their perspective, they did follow the protocols. But that's also the point. Sometimes institutional protocols aren't enough. Sometimes the rules for when and how a university intervenes don't keep up with reality. And the reality is this. Multiple women were uncomfortable. Multiple faculty members were concerned. Multiple complaints were filed. Behavior was documented. Problems escalated. And the university responded with meetings instead of decisive intervention. And maybe that's at the heart of the whole thing. We have a cultural problem, a far bigger problem than WSU, far bigger than this case, where institutions minimize pattern behavior because it's easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth. Dangerous people don't show up fully formed. They show up as boundary pushers. They show up as intimidators. They show up as people who make women feel unsafe. And when institutions treat those early warning signs as nuances rather than threats, they create blind spots. Blind spots that only are too obvious after it's too late. I'm not saying WSU should have predicted the murders. I'm saying they're legally responsible for what happened. I'm not saying, rather, they're legally responsible for what happened in Idaho. I want to be clear on that. What I am saying is what the Goncalves family is saying, is that if these red flags didn't justify treating him as someone who posed a risk, then what exactly would a student have to do for a university to take that step? How obvious does it need to be? How many complaints? How much discomfort? How many warning signs before the department says this isn't just odd behavior, this is dangerous behavior? It's a fair question. The red flags were everywhere. Students felt them, faculty felt them, the university documented them, and yet the institutional response never matched the level of concern people privately expressed, at least not in a timely enough manner. So I go back to the beginning. How much rope do we give people like this? That's why the Goncalves family is pushing into the light, not blame. Not finger-pointing, but a demand for accountability from a system that too often files complaints away as administrative chores instead of signs of potential harm. And that is the question that lingers long after the timeline is laid out and the documentation is reviewed. If these red flags didn't matter, what would? That's the question. Your thoughts in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already there, please check us out. Just search Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. You'll find us there. Please hit subscribe. We're trying to get to 100,000 by the end of the year. We're getting closer. With your help, we can probably make it. But we'll see. So please do that. Most importantly, your thoughts in the comments. Want to see it? We read them. We reply. Let's hear it. Until next time, I'm Tony Brueski. We'll talk again real soon.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Brueski and the Hidden Killers podcast. This is Hidden Killers Live with Tony Brueski, Stacey Cole, and Todd Michaels.
The Goncalves family is filing a lawsuit against WSU. That's the university that Bryan Kohberger was a teaching assistant at, not the school at which their children were attending or their daughter was attending, but certainly part of the ecosystem of the story of Bryan Kohberger. Today we're going to be tackling the thing everyone tiptoes around, the difference between a person who's simply socially odd and a person who is showing red flags that point towards potential danger. Washington State University had dozens of complaints against Bryan Kohberger, women who felt physically uncomfortable, faculty who documented behavioral issues, a department that held mandatory meetings because of one student, one teaching assistant, and at the same time, a man with no criminal history, no documented violence, no official reason to remove him really from anything. This is where psychology, pattern recognition, civil liberties, and institutional failure all collide. And nobody breaks down that collision like Robin Dreeke, who's going to help us get into this conversation and help dissect what exactly it is we're looking at when we hear about the Goncalves' decision to sue the school. They're not saying that the school would have prevented the murders. What they're saying is they have an obligation when you have enough complaints to do something a little more proactively than they did, because they did eventually fire him. But it did take a lot of checking boxes and a lot of meetings and a lot of this and a lot of that before anything actually took place. Robin, when you look at the specific behaviors reported, the intense staring, blocking doorways, hovering near women's offices, what do those behaviors indicate from a human behavior standpoint, not criminally, just instinctual human signaling?
Yeah, so those behaviors that Kohberger was exhibiting are behaviors of control. Control and inappropriate, unhealthy behavior, I should say, just because he was off, socially just way, way off. And like you said, just because you're socially off doesn't mean that you're doing any criminal activity. But when you look at, as we do, our arcs and norms of human behavior in context in certain areas, he was definitely standing out from that. And part of that is he would then fall into, especially as an employee, a standard of conduct that is incongruent with his condition of employment, because every employment organization has, a clause in there that says professional conduct. Mm-hmm. And clearly his behavior was unprofessional, but what they lacked was leadership. And it doesn't surprise me at all that the family that exudes leadership mm-hmm. is suing the university that failed completely at leadership, because that's what this was. The more and more I dug at this and said what was missing, because it's hard to kind of put your hands or fingers on it, it really just came striking out at me. When that was leadership, there was kind of a policy, but when you fear enacting a policy, it means that people are fearful of what will happen to them. So they're not going to take action. And so what empowers people to not be fearful? Strong leadership that backs a policy. And that's what they lacked.
So do you think they could have done, if they had gotten in Bryan's face, and not aggressively, but look, we've got complaints against you. We're concerned about, right. But spoke to him and said, we are not going to tolerate this. Does that change how a perpetrator performs in that environment? Do they become more aggressive? Do they go, wow, okay, I'm being disciplined, I need to do something? What happens with somebody like this? Not necessarily in Bryan's case, but when you see someone like this, what do you do?
Yeah, it's a really sticky one, Stacey, because someone like Kohberger, where, again, I think he was on an arc of predestiny of doing violence against human beings, because he had a lot of issues that were unable to be mitigated. Because I really think his family did a good job of trying to mitigate it. Could they have done better? Hindsight's always 20/20. Anyone can always do better. But what happened in this case was that if you're going to intercede, and they needed to intercede earlier, and it's one of the hardest lessons I learned in the Marine Corps as a young Marine Corps officer, was that, hey, if I had a behavior of one of my Marines that was off, I had, when I was at Parris Island, I had drill instructors that were 4 times much experienced, twice as old as me, that I was leading. If they did a behavior that was completely inappropriate and off, that was against policy and procedure, I had to sit them down in front of me. I had to write it out exactly what expectations were for the behavior, what the standard was, how their exact observed behavior was incongruent with that. I sign it, you sign it, and then we'll have another discussion if this doesn't change in a certain time frame. And then you have it documented, and then you can dismiss someone. Now, to the greater question, would that have prevented anything? Those hypotheticals are so hard because he was on an arc. But what I saw from what the I can't even say their name. Goncalves were trying to do, and rightfully so. They're not saying that this would have prevented the deaths of our daughter or the other 3 children, but it might have mitigated it. It might have done something, but at the very least, there should be some sort of culpability for a lack of leadership, a lack of enforcing policies. Because when I did I do my deep research. When I did deep research on this, I said, all right, so does WSU have a policy of this kind of conduct? And yes, they do. And I said, who's responsible for that policy? It can't be locked down. I said, who came up with that policy? It can't be locked down. It's like the HR office. I said, who is ultimately responsible for that policy? In other words, who does it get reported to? And it's nebulous. And when things are nebulous, there's fear. No fear, people take action until it's shoved down on you because people are so afraid of being labeled. All these different labels today, like any form of profiling whatsoever, and will get fearful. Now, there are universities, I did the research on this, there are universities that actually have a centralized point where you can report things without fear for not being profiling or anything like that. Like UConn has it, University of Wisconsin has it, because I was trying to do we have a compare and contrast where there's universities doing it properly? Yes, there are. It's just in this case, they had a policy-ish, but zero knowledge of who's responsible for report this to, besides department heads, which then are going to have to pass it up. In other words, there was no centralized point of leadership that said, hey, I am on this. I got your back. We got to intervene earlier. And here's how to do it. Like literally just what I said. It is so easy to not label someone as good, bad, right, or wrong. Here's just behavior that's incongruent, like blocking doors. Right. Like hovering over people, like staring at people. These are actually observed behaviors. You put it down on a piece of paper. This is what we're defining as unprofessional for a teaching assistant. Don't do this again. Don't ever get in the way of someone again. Don't do this behavior again. I sign, you sign. Because now it's not me saying, I heard this or I think you shouldn't be doing this. No, here's the behavior. Don't do it. Sign, you sign. If I see it again in a week, you're gone. If they'd done that earlier on, things would have.
And it seems like they did do that to a certain extent. It's just more so about how effective was it? And obviously, some people, you can write them up all you want. If this is how they act, it's how they act, and you're not going to change it if they don't think anything's wrong. But it's at what point how many warnings do you give? Eventually, they did fire him, but it took many, many months to get there and many, many complaints to get there. And that's where it's the weird ground. It's that middle, it's that gray area where you have the university or you have whatever entity you want to talk about, whether it's this case or another case, where people are so fearful that they're going to step on the rights of basically the perpetrator or someone who's causing the uncomfortable behavior, if it's standing in the doorway or whatever it may be. They're fearful that they're going to offend that person, and that person is going to have some sort of rights that trump the rights of the person making to be felt uncomfortable, because you get into the territory of, are they autistic? Is this some sort of autism thing? Or there's always the what ifs. And there's too many what ifs where people just don't seem to be able to come out and feel legally or professionally safe to call out this type of behavior in any sort of real, effective, true, authentic way. And then you have the people who are portraying this behavior that either are completely clueless about it, which I think Kohberger was, or they are doing it intentionally and they know exactly what they're doing and they're not going to stop. But it's how do you correct this? How do you get in there? How is WSU wrong in what they did here? They did document. They did have talks. They did sit down. They did warn. It didn't happen like that overnight, but they did follow up on all of these things. And after so many strikes, they did finally get rid of him. And at about the pace I would expect a university to do it at, too. And maybe that's the weird part here is we all expect this to take forever because that's how it seems to go because of so many precautions. I think WSU sits in a really weird place where damned if you do, damned if you don't. They can't just fire the guy for being weird and awkward and creepy. That's not breaking any laws, and they can't kick him out either for that. They're going to get sued by him or whoever they would be doing that to. At the same point, you're putting all these people in possible harm's way, but it's just possible. We don't know because there hasn't been any sort of actual harm done other than them feeling uncomfortable by the actions of Kohberger in this case. I don't know where to sit on this. I mean, I wish we could do something more proactive, but I feel legally, I think their hands are tied.
So I think it's a frustration because I don't think people have thought through this innovatively. And here's what I mean. Here's an idea of what I think could be done. So, and I'm with you, and that's why I think it's going to be a tough lawsuit for them for the Goncalves to pursue just because of all these things you're talking about. They didn't fail in the ultimate execution. Where I believe they could do better is the tempo. And when you actually, and here's a way you can escalate that tempo, because tempo is slowed when people have fear. And the way you get over fear, again, let's go back to the leadership model. And here's what you can do, because I'm going to walk through what we did on the espionage side of things. Because when you're going to do a major case where you're going to try to, I want not entrap a spy, but when you're trying to do a double agent operation and you're trying to pass information, fake information to a bad guy on the other side of the steel curtain or whatever on the Russian side or something, you have to get pre-approvals for things. And you're always constantly going through what ifs. We go through legal counsel, we go through the CIA, we go through State Department. We game plan out all the what ifs so that when we actually go to execute, we can execute this fast. Because if you slow tempo, the bad guy thinks they have freedom to do whatever they want. So I know it's kind of nebulous what I was talking about. So here's what we do on this side. Here's where people do much better with tempo. And also when tempo is in place, it's actually a great mitigator of abhorrent actions, because when a potential perpetrator knows that there's clear reciprocity for an action they're taking, they're less likely to take that action. Because if they can live in the gray zone, they're going to live in the gray zone as long as they possibly can. When things aren't clear, when they're not defined, when they don't think there is courage by people to take action. Because how they do it, they poke a little bit. Let's see if there's a reaction. Let's poke a little bit more, see if a reaction. And if there's slow to reaction, they're going to keep poking and try to encircle their realm of control, because they're slow to react, because there's soft words being used against them. Because remember, we're dealing with a highly developed predator that doesn't use soft words, that doesn't think softly. And when you're being treated that way with kid gloves because you're afraid of this, this, and this. So how do we empower people to not be fearful? All these things we're talking about here is what you play out before it happens. Everything, all these ahas and what ofs and what things we should have done are reactionary. No one there thought enough proactively to what do we have to make sure we can do like this if this situation happens. So there's tons of case studies like Kohberger out there. What you do is this: if you're in the leadership of this university, of HR, is you say, all right, here's our policy. Now we got to play the what ifs. How do we enact this policy, empower people to feel safe to report, empower people to feel safe to do X, Y, and Z? And how do we do it so that we feel safe to support them? Well, we got to get the lawyers involved. How do we do this so it doesn't make us liable? So we need to paper it this way. We need to paper it this way. So you do training, you sensitivity training, and you actually empower people to know here's the process, here's procedure, here's the measure, here's the legal side. So that way, any of these nefarious people that think, well, they'll never do it because law is on my side. No, we let them know right up front. We talk to our lawyers. Lawyers say this is how we're going to do things. So again, and what's this all doing? We're treating people with respect. We're being ultimately transparent. And for what? Safety. Safety can't take a backseat ever. And if we got to do these things and don't go through these machinations ahead of time to give our lawyers the what ifs, it's something like a Kohberger case, but it's unsafe. What can we do? What legally can we do? What legally can it do? So that way the people are actually on the ground at the granular level, feel empowered to do something so it doesn't drag on. And so that the person, the perpetrator of evil doesn't feel they can live in a gray zone for as long as they do.
And, I mean, in this case, I mean, I hear you. And that's where I think a lot of it just backs up to is the legal end of things. Of, well, you can't do this because of this right, because of that right, because everybody has too many rights. Essentially, is what it comes down to. When everybody has too many rights, nobody's actually being protected because everybody has the right to do everything to everybody. And then what do we have? But with this. How, I mean, in this case specifically, let's say Kohberger never went through and actually killed the people, was just autistic and creepy in his mannerisms, completely clueless about them, because I think he is clueless about them. I don't think he has any idea just how creepy his behavior is and how bizarre it is. And I think it's just his modality. It's how he works. It's how his brain functions. His brain tells him, this is what you do. This is how you do it. And then the rest of the world, it's like, Jesus, why are you acting like that? And he's just as confused, like, why are people reacting to me this way? He's off. I mean, it's part of the autism, and the way that he's seeing things and the way he's interpreting things is very different than the way other people would do it. So, how do you get in there in a case like this, and try to correct behavior that really can't be that corrected because it's just part of who he is? If you're autistic, you can't be like, oh, let me be less autistic for you today. It's just how the brain works. It's how they're going to function. Can there be learned behavior of, well, I'm going to walk this back, I'm going to learn not to do it, emulating behavior? Yes, that certainly is a thing to a certain extent, again, depending on where you are on this spectrum and what you're going to understand and what you're going to pick up and what you're going to accept. I just don't know. And look, I'm not trying to defend Kohberger here, and I'm not trying to defend WSU, but I just don't know when you have somebody that has a brain that works as differently as Kohberger's did, that you can get out in front of this and foolproof predict or stop or really do much of anything. And what do you do at the end of the day here? Let's say they did act a little faster. So they fired him. If they would have fired him 2 months sooner, would that have stopped anything? Maybe he would have moved back home. Maybe. Yep. But at the same point, you're passing the trash then, which is the problem that we have in a lot of education systems, a lot of public education systems, elementary education and high school education and things of that nature. That's what we were talking about earlier this year with the Devil's Den case and how he got passed from school to school to school. And like, how did nobody say anything? How did nobody do anything? Well, they did kind of, but it all ended up being locked down into the confines of each school, and nobody could share their stories with anybody. Again, all because of rights, because of the legal issues, not because people didn't want to do what was right, what was morally right, what would actually be ethical and for the safety of others, but because, again, laws and fear of being sued. It's a lot of people operating with a lot of fear in every which turn they come in situations like this, it feels like.
Yeah, these are tough ones for us as a society, but I'm going to give probably a controversial Gen X answer on this one. You know, some people just aren't suited for certain jobs.
Yeah.
You know,
100%.
So if he can't overcome his autism and how he's communicating, okay, we can work on it. We can try transparency. We can let your student body know, hey, he's working on these things. And if everyone agrees, hey, let's give him a shot. Great. But otherwise, then you shouldn't be fucking teaching. You know, get another job. Yeah. So, I mean, I want to be an astronaut. I want to be a Navy pilot. I want to do all these things in life. I mean, people ask me all the time, Robin, how'd you get to be the chief of behavioral analysis program in the FBI? It was easy. I failed at everything else I wanted to do because it was incongruent with what I want to do. I didn't have the intellect to get through aerospace engineering. So, you know what? I couldn't be an aerospace engineer. You know what Robin did? He figured out something else. And so just because he thinks he's entitled to do this because he had Professor Ramsland saying he's good at criminology, you know what? But maybe you really shouldn't teach because you're kind of a creepo. And if the bottom line, the university doesn't exist to give him a job. The university exists to educate their kids in a safe environment so they can learn. And if the guy you have teaching them is incongruent and incompatible and no one's learning because he's such a friggin' creep, then you got to get rid of him. It's incongruent. Go find another job. Not saying that you're dysfunctional in life, but you know what? Your lack of ability to communicate and not come across creepy. And if you're not overcoming it, you put them on a pip or whatever you're doing. If it ain't working, you just aren't meant to do this. There's a lot of people in life. You're just not meant to do things. That's why you get fired. That's why you move on. That's why you try other things. And that's how we learn and get better, because we get a good life rep in, because just think about what he could learn. All right. Instead of being coddled and told you're great at doing this and eventually can you imagine if he had actually passed and became a professor? Who the hell would take his course?
Right.
It's like ridiculous because he's so creepy. He's horrible. He's misogynistic, all the things he's accused of. So the thing he was actually pursuing in life was completely incongruent with him being successful at it. So find something else with that skill set.
Are there places, and I first let me preface it, I am not defending Bryan Kohberger. But is there a place for him to get the help that he needs to do the job that he wants and have, I don't know, somebody to babysit him? And it's not the university's job, but are there places in our world for someone like him who has something going on so that he can do a job, use his skills, and maybe learn something instead of just being thrown to the wolves?
So I think so, yes. I don't know those places, but I know some good friends that became good friends and associates and contacts of mine that are way high on the spectrum that actually are barred lawyers. They're very good at certain things because they actually have the one thing that Kohberger completely lacks. And so people can overcome an awful lot when you have what? Humility.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I suck at this. I'm going to get in reps over here. So my entire life, I'm using a me statement. I hate these things in here because, again, I'm hypersensitive to it. But all my active empathy, curiosity, understanding, deep love of others, and being so deeply curious when I see things and people incongruent with things that I normally accept in life, that wasn't me 50 years ago. You know, I grew up a snarky, self-centered, not self-centered really, but, snarky extrovert, in upstate New York that, I had a mouth that ran away with me. And in order to overcome those things, you get a lot of reps and humbling moments. But I had only one thing that was going right in my mindset, and that was I owned it. When something went sideways, I said, oh, I must be doing something wrong. And see, that's what Kohberger has got wrong. That's what all these broken people we talk about on the show have wrong, is they have so little emotional intelligence. Their EQ is so bottomed out. I don't care about your IQ. It's no measure of life success at all. Their EQ is so bottomed out, their self-awareness is so low that they have a lack of ability to improve in these areas. Their baseline is flat. And so people can learn, they can get better. If you're on the spectrum, can you do jobs? And Stacey, when you said it's like, no one's entitled to a job. No one owes you a job. You either can get better and you do the job or not. And he clearly couldn't, because his effect, his baseline understanding of who he was zero. Hey, go get some reps, go get some humility, and then you can try again. But now you're completely incompatible with his job. My son, the fighter jet pilot guy, and my daughter too, the amazing labor and delivery nurse. Every day I tell my son as he's going out to fly this jet, I said the three things as he's getting a bad day coming up or a challenging day. I always remember him these things. I say, stay positive, stay safe, and be a great student. That's our mantra in life. You do those three things and everything else will flow. But that's exactly what he missed. Kohberger was not positive. He's always a wound collector. Definitely not a good student. And safety, he made people feel unsafe. And so he was bottomed out on those three major pillars that actually allow us to move forward in life and get some great healthy reps in.
Want more on this case and others? Then press subscribe now and don't miss a moment of true crime coverage from Tony Brueski and the Hidden Killers podcast.